Radio. Tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Sara tāko ingoa, nō reira tēnā koutou katoa. Ena mana, ena reo, ena karanga tanga maha, tēnā koutou katoa. Talofa lava, bula vanika, kia orana, malo olale, and warm Pacific greetings. And welcome to our first talk of the year for Hei Kaupapa Hononga. It's lovely to see people back in person, but we also have Zoom and it will be recorded as well. So lovely to see those people on Zoom, kia ora mawera, and great to be back having these conversations again. So it gives me great pleasure to present Professor Karen Nairn today, who's going to be talking about a book. And I've just said, did you have RSL to write this book, or have you been doing it while you're not on RSL? So a huge accomplishment to be doing this, a little bit of RSL, but you know how hard it is to get that writing time. So it's super exciting to see, and also to hear more about our rangatahi as well. So I'll pass straight over to you, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and kia ora koutou, ngā mihi nui kia koutou. Thank you so much for coming along, and yes, a great opportunity to just share one of the chapters in the book. So the climate crisis is not just a problem of agreeing on collective action. It is also too easily pushed onto the back burner because of the time horizon for the potential effects of inaction. And the bleakest events will likely occur beyond the lifetime of politicians and the current electoral cycles that they respond to. And hence it is young people leading the charge for a future that's not shit, that many of the Generation Zero members said during our research with them. Recently, we've had a taste of these bleakest events and what they might look like. The Auckland flooding at the start of February, and 2 weeks later, Cyclone Gabrielle put climate change centre stage. And I know that it's not only climate change that's playing a role here, it's also our land use, particularly forestry and agriculture on steep hillsides and floodplains that are all part of the mix. And I just wanted to ask, you know, I'm aware that some of you are on Zoom, but how many of you have had, you know, whānau or friends affected by Gabrielle or the flooding in Auckland? And you know, yes, and I can see one member of the Zoom, yes. And also against this, I want to acknowledge Vanuatu that had 2 cyclones in succession. You know, we think it's terrible what's happened here, but it's also happening elsewhere. And in amongst that, we've had, you know, the wonderful news of the Vanuatu PM today leading such important idea of getting the International Criminal Justice Court to look at what does it mean for our obligations to countries who are in the path of these devastating weather events, particularly in the Pacific. So really thinking about the Pacific. So, and in amongst this, we have got the latest report from the IPCC. And, you know, again, I'm aware that many of you will be familiar with this report, and one of the Generation Zero people that we talked with talked about just how depressing this was to read at the earlier reports, and how the collective of Generation Zero kind of supported her to face reading something like this. And you know, I think as I read it before this presentation, I can see what she's talking about. And you'll be aware that, you know, even us limiting the temperature to 1.5 is looking highly unlikely, and just looking at the kind of potential ramifications of overshooting. And I think we've already seen some of that in recent weather events. So in 2017, when I applied for a Marsden grant to fund this research, the climate crisis was already clearly evident. And we invited 6 activist groups that have a majority of youth members and or young people in leadership roles to tell us about their experiences with activism, and all 6 groups agreed to be named. And I'm going to tell you all of the groups because we covered a really diverse range of issues that people were addressing, young people were addressing. So Protect Ihu Mātao, fighting the impact of colonisation by reclaiming Indigenous land confiscated in 1863. Just Speak aims to reduce and ultimately eliminate incarceration. Action Station is a people-powered online petition platform addressing diverse social and economic justice issues. Inside Out Koaro is promoting rainbow youth visibility and safety in schools and communities. And Thursdays in Black, which was based at University of Auckland, is working towards a future without sexual violence. And all of our participants were concerned about climate change, and all of them were involved in all kinds of ways in climate action. Many identified how colonial, eco and gender violence connect and overlap. And even if they belong to a group whose vision prioritised one key issue. And today's presentation is about Generation Zero, particularly the Auckland group, and they prioritised climate action. So a contingent of young New Zealanders attended the 2010 UN climate talks in Cancun. In 2011, the following year, they formed Generation Zero. It's primarily urban based, has university chapters are often established depending on the size of the city. And this image is from 2016 when the national organisation launched their campaign for the zero carbon legislation outside Parliament. And that campaign took 3 years, bringing together members from regional groups to work as a national collective. So these were our research methods, and that gives you the kind of key points in bold. And we did an enormous amount of ethnographic fieldwork with each of these groups. There was a team of 5 of us, and they were primarily based in Wellington and Auckland. And so these in-depth activist history interviews were fascinating. And we wanted to look at what sustained people over time and staying part of a group. And we followed up with those who had left as well in that time frame. And we also followed their social media channels, and we had this idea of asking them to do what we called a living manifesto, where the groups would come up with their vision. Most of them already had their vision. They had already established that. And so, but the groups nevertheless came up with kind of various ways that they expressed that. And we might have a chance to look at one of those at the end. So many activists in the study wanted their real names used, and others wanted their code names. And we don't distinguish between those two because obviously that would could out people. And not all of our participants saw themselves as activists. They had various other names they went by, like lobbyists, volunteers, kaitiaki, protectors of the whenua in the case of Ihu Mātao, rather than protesters, a really important intervention in the discourse. And so, one of them talked about, one participant talked about how she was referred to by her parents as the activist child, even if she didn't necessarily call herself that. So, but I tend to use activists for the kind of sake of having a kind of reasonably coherent narrative, but mindful of different terminology in play. And today we're focusing on the Generation Zero Auckland group, and even then there was an Auckland University group as well, but we mainly worked with the Auckland group. And that gives you the time frame and a little bit of a sense of the participants' demographics. But many, many more people were involved in all of those events that we went to. We went to meetings, to a whole set of actions that I'm going to tell you about today. We're part of our work. And we had a memorandum of understanding to try and negotiate a form of kind of group consent, and we've written about the challenges of that, and happy to talk about those things of what it means to turn up at an event and announce that you're a researcher trying to gather data as well, and the challenges of that. And one of the members of the group acknowledged that the Auckland group still struggles with being very monocultural. And it's interesting that there's authors Dodson and Papusaki, probably pronouncing that name really badly, conducted a membership survey of Generation Zero in mid-2014 and noted key demographics that were very similar to what we noted in 2018 through to 2020. So important just to give you a sense of the group. And this is part of what is a challenge for many climate action groups, is the predominance of Pākehā or white membership, and what that means. Like, there's been lots of talk about racism and the climate action movement and so on. So one of the things that we're interested in is what it means to be defined as a youth organisation. And the emphasis on youth often establishes the moral authority of the fight, but this can also hinder the movement. Not only does it burden young people with the responsibility to address climate change, the equating of youth with idealism can undermine politicians and the broader public's willingness to take young activists seriously. And we draw on Sakurai and Tannick's work. Like, they talk about the global sort of politics of youth movements and just the kind of schism of how seriously they get taken or not. Yet Generation Zero is a real player in New Zealand politics, as Samantha, her quote, and our book in this presentation will demonstrate. So this is their theory of change, and this first quote was during a training session that we were at. An older member described the group in this way: we're pretty openly lobbyists. There's a blurry line dividing lobbying and activism. We do whatever we need to do to get shit done. So the activist lobbyists, non-partisan, possibly we could even talk about Generation Zero as the respectable arm of the environmental movement. Success was judged in pragmatic terms. Nearly all the Auckland group thought climate activism needs multiple actors taking different approaches, and that's there in Hamish's quote. So in the lexicon of environmental movements, Generation Zero can be understood as light green or reformist, contrasting, which is where they're trying to achieve changes that protect the environment, but also prioritise human activity to a certain extent, in contrast to the deep ecology movements that prioritise the earth ahead of human activity. So just situating them in terms of that kind of broader literature. And it's really interesting. Dewey talks about how she was perceived as working with the dark side by working with corporates, and I think this is so they're aware that this non-partisan approach is sometimes viewed as working with the dark side. And I'll read out Dewey's words because I think it's really important what she has to say. I started off in the activism world and am now part of the corporate world. I think that there's still a lot of animosity between the two parts of society. And I think that is so outdated. Giving people the responsibility to move towards a clean economy, I think that there could be a lot more synergy between the activism world and businesses. And another, just trying to select kind of key quotes to give you a sense of people's motivations. And Olivia here is talking about just the importance of collective action. She was thinking about joining an environmental organisation for a while and doing a bit of research about the importance of collective action and how individual actions don't achieve structural change. And she was particularly aware of racism, and then she was getting more and more engaged in climate change, starting to realise that I needed to engage with other people who are doing greater things than I could do on my own in order to contribute. And there was many participants that talked about their motivations in that way. Well, Generation Zero Auckland pitched a big political tent. And I think it's quite important, you know, yes, all the groups we work with could be understood as socially progressive, but even within those groups, there was a diversity of political motivations. And members were clear that the environmental crisis and colonialism are linked phenomena. And this is Stephen talking about, you know, ihu mātau. There was lots of interaction between groups, actually, is the other thing. You know, Generation Zero supported the reclamation at ihu mātau and so on. But again, just looking at how the land that was confiscated had been intensified and developed in a way that's also adding to the climate crisis. And for Indigenous scholar Kyle White, climate change is intensified colonialism. And there's others who echo his work. So what I'm going to do now is just give you a sense of the diversity of actions that Generation Zero engaged in while we were working with them, and you know, look at some of their achievements in a relatively short time that we worked with them. So within the context of Generation Zero's pragmatic theory of change, actions ranged along the continuum from lobbying to activism. In 2013, Gen Zero Auckland initiated the well-regarded and high-profile scorecards of the environmental credentials of candidates running for the local body and national elections. And this is the scorecard for 2016, Auckland mayoral candidates, which features Chloe Swardbrick, whose campaign laid the foundation for her election as a Green MP in 2017 at the age of 23, and her success in the Auckland Central seat in the 2020 election. And it's, you know, just really interesting to see how those scorecards distill information down to get people thinking about who they're voting for. And Jay talks about how whenever elections roll around, it's a fantastic way of distilling down into very pointed, very direct questions about housing, transport, and the environment, which are the three sort of key grassroots level areas where Generation Zero believes that we can make a difference. In Gen Zero's experience, certainly it holds our elected officials' feet to the fire significantly more than if the scorecard wasn't there. And this is a huge amount of work involved. Like, they were interviewing across all political parties, candidates for Auckland, and doing this in their own time over and above jobs and university studies and whatever they were engaged in. And, you know, some people didn't agree to the interviews as well. So that was a key action. And that scorecard idea is migrated, and you'll be aware of how we have those kind of types of ideas in recent elections. Another really key action was their parking days, was a collaboration between Gen Zero Auckland and Women in Urbanism. And we attended one in 2018, where for a day, central Auckland car parks were turned into recreational spaces by setting up activities, you know, astroturf, deck chairs, children's play area. It was really inspiring. You get a glimpse in this photograph. And, you know, soap buttables, music, really making it family friendly. And as people stopped to find out what was going on, they would talk about their, you know, the group and their message. And more than 283 adults and children enjoyed one car park on parking day, compared with its use by 9 cars on a typical day. And I think it packs a really powerful punch in terms of message and how we have a lot of dead space in car parks. And again, this is a quote chosen because I think it sums up the significance. Had such a big effect on individuals on the street, and then also people in power. It caught the attention of the politicians who actually turned up. So yeah, I really love that, how much influence we have as a small collective. Before I joined them, I felt like just an individual who didn't really have power. So it's like a portal between the small people and the big people. I love that concept of the portal. So scorecards, parking days, and similar events fall closer to the activism side of the activist lobbyist continuum. And we're going to talk a bit more about some of the kind of lobbying activities. So the push for cycleways has required lots of lobbying work of Auckland Council, and not all campaigns have been successful, at least not in the time initially envisaged. Echoing assessments from a number of senior members across the group, Avery reflected on stalled or limited outcomes. And again, I'm just going to pick up on key, I'll leave you to read fully, but the Sky Path, you'll be aware that has been canned, but was one of the biggest petitions Generation Zero ran in 2014. The K Road cycle lanes were ultimately opened in 2021, but at the time that we were talking with Avery, they hadn't been opened. And you can get a sense of just how we had a ton of people turn out, Avery says, but they're not built there yet. Like just this year with the Westmere cycle lanes, a ton of people. We counted the narrative, we got really good media coverage, but still I don't think we've had a lot of long-term effect in a bunch of these cases. We don't have the resources to continue to lobby. So you can see just an enormous amount of energy going into these, a lot of respect in Auckland for Generation Zero's initiatives, but just how hard it is to get this happening. Other activities straddle the line between activism and lobbying. Campaigns like Freeze the Fears, which Gen Zero were really integral to in Auckland. They also had campaigns to extend the bus timetable at night, and were part of promoting or getting free public transport for under 15-year-olds. So really significant achievements, and they wouldn't say that they were the sole players in that, but were key players. But the big one is the Zero Carbon Act, and is often seen as synonymous with Generation Zero. And the Auckland group's work on the Zero Carbon Act took place on a parallel track with all these local Auckland actions that I've just talked about. The local group would meet on Tuesday nights, the Zero Carbon Act group would meet on Wednesday nights. The Zero Carbon Act group often then met other nights and weekends with the rest of the national organisation around the country. And they were often doing this at the end, like I went to many of these meetings, often around the kind of 6 o'clock mark. People coming straight from university or work, and it's over their tea time. I really noticed it, just thinking about bring snacks along, but often going through to 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. There was a lot of time and energy at the end of the day to do this work. And posters were one of many strategies the group used to promote the Zero Carbon Act alongside what they call quick submits. And we went to one of these at the Karangahape Roads Festival, where, again, just distilling information down into the key bullet points, having many electronic devices available so that people can submit on the spot. And it was pretty impressive to see what that means to kind of go up to people who have turned up for the K Road Festival, to then be completing a submission, a quick submit on the Zero Carbon Bill. And that quick submit was developed by the Auckland team at an earlier stage before we started working with them. And here it is. On the one hand, the Zero Carbon Act is a huge win for Generation Zero. a major piece of national legislation that it had midwifed from first draft through to enactment, and this is where, you know, the enactment here. And it was passed in November 2019, and you'll see our Dame Patsy Reddy with a member of her staff. You'll probably recognise Rod Carr. And the two people from Generation Zero are actually the Wellington-based national conveners of this national campaign. So they, that's James Young-Drew, who's directly behind Patsy Reddy, and also Lisa McLaren as well. So they were key people and have also been enormously helpful in, you know, putting, as we put together the visual narrative for the book. Lisa McLaren I'd like to acknowledge, and she has done a PhD about Generation Zero as well. On the other hand, the group couldn't control what the group couldn't control were the amendments that weakened key goals. Although this win some, lose some outcome fits with Generation Zero's pragmatic brand and theory of change, it sits less well with some members than others. And I think Dewey, you know, just the elation that's conveyed in that first quote, you know, here we were sitting around on Wednesday nights and this is what we managed to achieve. And then just how hard that was to watch. Personally, the most difficult part was allowing the politicians to take it through the parliamentary process and to some extent water down some of the most important parts of the Act, such as the enforcement. This has caused a huge misunderstanding in the public that the Act has no teeth. The Act is enforceable, and as activists, we will ensure that it is enforced and implemented. So you might remember the research question that I showed earlier, what inspires and sustains young activists? And we were interested in the role of hope. I mean, we were interested in the whole range of emotional motivations, such as anger and anguish and fear as well. And this, particularly hoping critically, is beautifully encapsulated by Dewey. We're hearing a lot from her, but she says things so well. And here she, and I'm going to read the whole thing out because I think it's quite important. Hope as one emotion has to be actually balanced with anger. And I think that anger is mainly pushed by the reality. I think that the reason why I'm having the juxtaposition between idealism and reality was because I started off being idealistic, but I kept going because of the reality. If you look at reality right now, not much change is happening, and I am angered by that, or I'm frustrated by that. So I think that talking about idealism and reality is super important, not just in terms of bringing people in, but in dictating how we work. So hoping critically means acknowledging both the hope of and the obstacles to addressing climate change. Holding both prevents retreating into an either or of giving up or hoping naively without acknowledgement of the difficulties in the way. Acknowledging anguish and fear as reasonable responses to the climate crisis rather than relegating them to the status of anxiety symptoms, which I think is the problem with the word eco-anxiety. You know, that we actually are better to start thinking about hoping critically, which encompasses that idea of, you know, acknowledging the fear and anger, as well as the hope that something might come of taking action collectively. And we're drawing these ideas, particularly this idea of hoping critically as a process rather than a destination, from Victoria McGear's work. She's talked a lot about how we learn to hope from those around us. And I think activist spaces are really important sites for us to think about how hope operates as a social and collective phenomenon rather than an individual disposition. And I'm in amongst writing about that at the moment. We didn't work directly with School Strike for Climate, but Gen Zero Auckland did. In fact, it was really interesting to watch the kind of collaborations and support both organisations offered each other. And in 2019, you'll be aware of the school strike for climate marches that took place throughout Aotearoa and across the world. And this image is of the thousands gathered in Aotea Square in Auckland on the 15th of March, including many members of Generation Zero. And I know that this day was overshadowed by the terrible events in Christchurch in terms of the mosque shooting. But the sheer numbers that turned out across the country, and I remember being here in Dunedin, it really felt like change was possible, and many of the Gen Zero members that we interviewed in 2019 talked about the significance of these marches. And following on from its success with the Zero Carbon Act, the national group of Generation Zero facilitated a 55-page submission to the Climate Change Commission. And then that in 2021 was released detailing the pathway that New Zealand would need to take to meet its Paris Climate Accord commitments. So we kind of stopped taking official note of Generation Zero's achievements at that point, and we finished the research in 2020 and finished the book in 2022. So, like the group just kept on rolling. I remember going to the last meeting in Auckland, and already, there was half of them were new members, and that kind of idea of aging out and that constant sort of churn of membership, which can be both bring new energy but also be a challenge, was very much evident. So I began this with images of recent climate events in New Zealand, and then noticing how Marama Davidson and James Shaw are saying that this is the climate election. And I just delved a bit deeper into thinking about this as kind of bookends to my presentation. And I don't know whether, did anyone hear Marama Davidson's interview with Hinarangi Forbes on Mata just recently? I mean, she makes a compelling, yes, great, I'm just noticing, I can see one person on Zoom, which is great. And she makes a compelling case about the impact of climate change on rural communities in the East Coast, and, just how, why we should be treating this as a climate election, and how that's interwoven with rural poverty and all the consequences of recent events that have really hit rural and Māori communities. And then you have the other side of this, which is Toby Manhire, who's written for the Spin-Off, who's telling us what the polls show and how this might not necessarily be a climate election. Has anyone read that? And what I've done is just selected some key details from his write-up. I recommend both the interview with Marama Davidson and this. So the Ipsos Issues Monitor is based on a thrice yearly survey, and it asks respondents to identify the 3 most important issues facing New Zealand. And the latest monitor was undertaken in the white heat of Cyclone Gabrielle. And that saw the highest proportion of people picking climate change as one of those 3 since the poll began. And there's some key figures there, but it still was only 27%. Now, Sam Crawley has undertaken a survey in New Zealand and Australia as part of postdoctoral research on public opinion and climate change, and I think it's really interesting. Along with the fires and floods, the higher level of importance accorded to climate change in Australia may be a result of frustration at governments downplaying the issue in recent years, is what Crawley interprets. The numbers for New Zealand were broadly in line with most of Europe, he said, with the exception of the Nordic countries, where climate change is given greater importance. And I think it's really interesting to look at these figures in the light of Sam Crawley's work. And particularly severe weather events make people more concerned and attuned to climate change, but usually for only about 3 to 6 months. And then it tends to fade. So from that perspective, it is unlikely to be a climate change election. So on that provocative note, I thought I'd open it up for discussion, and I know that Zoom people can send questions via chat. I want to reserve a couple of minutes to end with a living manifesto that was produced by a collaboration between Action Station and Just Speak, which I think it's thinking about 2040, message from 2040. So I want to finish with that and just have an interlude for discussion or questions. Yeah. So open the floor. And we've got a microphone as well, which is, here we are. So, and why I'm going to give it to you is it makes the Zoom participants, enables them to hear your questions. Any questions? Thank you for coming.
The quote at the bottom there from Sam Crawley, was there anything to point to the fact that as those events become more frequent, the peak of awareness will be less and the tail off will happen quicker?
Yes, or the alternative, like as they become more frequent, will we really be taking it even more seriously when it starts hitting closer to home?
And that quote's in reference to population in general rather than to young people.
Yeah, it is. And it's between, looking at New Zealand and Australia. And I've yet to delve into his research. I had a look at his website this morning. He's obviously been doing, quite a lot on this and is yet to publish the data that is presented here as a formal kind of article. But I think his work is worth following, absolutely. Yes.
Hello, thanks for a really interesting talk. I'm interested in you talking about the youth groups being very interconnected with each other and looking at, I guess, like intersectionality of different problems. But these numbers and quotes on this last slide showing that the broader population doesn't seem to see the connections between more frequent extreme weather events and cost of living, poverty, other types of exclusion. And I wonder if you can speak to that, how these groups address that and how that could be brought into the wider public.
And, I think it is really challenging to be, get that uptake. I mean, I think Marama Davidson's analysis that is part of the interview with Mahanani Forbes is excellent. She's making all of those connections. And I think there are lots of people, old and young, who are making those connections. But yes, you can see the kind of frustration of what it means to do this work. Probably see glimpses of it in some of the quotes that I have presented, but also a chapter in the book focuses on the emotional work of all of this. And I think that there's an enormous amount of work that is involved in being part of taking collective action and making, like, so we have one chapter on the work of being part of a collective and another chapter on the emotional labour of this work, and I think it's really significant. And burnout is a big issue for activists and young activists in particular. And many of our groups were working over. We worked with them for 3 years, but they have been established often in the 2011, around that time, 2015 for Ihu Mātau. Really long-term projects that and getting uptake of a wider population taking it seriously is really challenging. So does that answer your question a little bit? Yeah, definitely frustration. We've got a question online. Let's go for online, and then we'll come back to in the room. Thank you for helping out with the microphone running.
This is from Mawera. Kia ora e te whānau. I worry that for too many of our country mates, it is too hard to get their heads around. How do we make sure this is a climate election? How do we enable the kind of understanding of the issue that makes this something people feel like they have some power in?
And yeah, fantastic question. Like, I think it's one that we're all kind of responsible for addressing. How do we keep this on the centre stage when, you know, we've got Chris Hipkins going for the cost of living, because this is not an either or situation. Cost of living is huge for all those flood affected people in places like Wairoa that, I mean, Marama Davidson said it so well, just saying how many of those people haven't got insurance, and this has had a huge impact on their lives. And you know, it's not just cost of living, this is all interwoven, and we need to keep climate change, all of us, on the government agenda, and not let it kind of be split Labour, Greens. You know, there's been some interesting political analysis of, you know, how that's useful for each of those parties, but actually this is not about political, you know, scoring. It's about our future. And I think as a member of the older generation, I see my role in this as really important, that it's not left to young people to drive this forward. I think Generation Zero have done an enormous favour to get the Zero Carbon Act across the line. But, you know, what are our responsibilities? Yep, so thank you for that question.
Thank you. It's great to see Generation Zero in Auckland doing so well. With respect to the wider population, I like to think most people believe in climate change and care about it, but it seems they don't care enough. I think one reason is possibly that they don't have enough fear. I think fear is an important component prior to empowerment. So you can't just empower people yet, they have to be scared about something. So possibly, I know it's like if the GP was to, you know, only withhold some of the truth to a patient, that's not ethical, right? You need to tell the whole bad story so that we can address it properly. So maybe people just don't understand like things like climate feedback loops properly, the possibility of irreversible global warming, or the financial economic impacts of that. They'll be absolutely enormous, unprecedented, right? So the way forward we need to instill fear, and that, I think that has to happen through knowledge, instilling knowledge as fast as possible about climate feedback loops, and also how it's going to hit people in the pocket is the most effective way. So I don't expect politicians or business people to do this, but I think maybe the activists are in the best position to do this.
And, you know, I think this, you know, makes some really important points, but fear can also be paralyzing. And so how do we kind of, you know, I think it's important to talk about the full picture, absolutely. But how do we support young people, ourselves? You know, like, I think there's going to be even tougher times ahead. I think this is going to be really challenging for people's mental health and all of that. So, you know, I think fear needs to be in conjunction with taking action, and that action can look like all kinds of, you know, greater and lesser scale action. Yep. Now, I think there's another question over here, and then Claire down here.
Thank you.
And you've got another one online. I'm keeping an eye on the time as well.
I'll try and be quick. I have a very brief comment and then a question. I'm Steve Walker. I'm a Dunedin City Councillor, and I just wanted to, in terms of being active or proactive, I sit around a table of councillors, some of whom don't believe there's a climate crisis. We're all very contactable. We don't get contacted enough about this, so I urge you all to do it, and urge your peer group and friends to do it as much as you can. My question stems from being an activist in the 80s and 90s. That's correct, Ray. And still, and still to a certain extent now, and now being in a position as an elected member. My question is to you, Karen, is if you've thought much about the missing links or the positive parts of that connective tissue that gets. My frustration as an activist was I couldn't get to speak to the politicians. My frustration as a politician is the activists don't come and speak to me.
And in some ways, I mean, Gen Zero was remarkable. You know, I know we worked with the Auckland group, but they were incredible in terms of having conversations with politicians and local government, you know, doing interviews. So I think that, and, you know, on one level they were critiqued for being more kind of reformist and working with the dark side, corporate and politicians, but I think they were really effective at fostering those conversations and built that over time. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. So that leads to another question. Is the local, and sorry, this is slightly off point, but is the local Gen Zero Dunedin group still active? Because it wasn't active during the last local election.
And I think it, you know, I think it is harder in a small city and, you know, just having enough people for that critical mass. So I think there are, you know, key people still doing stuff, but not an actual collective group. And I think that we're focusing on council submissions in the Dunedin's, but that's prior to the recent election outcome. Yeah. Now, Claire, who was next?
Hello. So I grew up in an urban area, but I'm suddenly researching in agriculture. And you mentioned how a lot of these groups are based in urban areas, but obviously a lot of the impacts are based in rural areas. And I was just wondering if you have any perspectives or you've talked to anybody who lives rurally on their thoughts on all of this sort of activism.
And that's a really good point. And Gen Zero would acknowledge that bias. And School Strike for Climate, I think, was remarkable in achieving groups in all kinds of places, you know, including Thames, for example. And, you know, there was a fantastic piece written in a book on climate change published by Bridget Williams Books. That's from a young woman from Tairawhiti, and how many people she managed to get turnout in Gisborne. So I think that there's a certain amount happening in provincial towns. That still isn't, you know, rural communities where there's even smaller population. So I think it's a really good question that you've asked. And what I might do is just play this video message from 2040, because I think it's a good note to end on. and what I want to do is offer to stay and answer any more questions I'm sorry that we're sort of cutting in here, but I'm really happy to stay on and that. So I've got we've done further writing about
Together we created an audacious plan to meet the challenges of our time, and then we made it happen. Some people ran for parliament while others rallied social movements to build people power for real change. And some of us got to work scaling up solutions that already exist in our communities, papakainga, community health hubs, and so much more. Over the next 10 years, we prioritised the things that matter for healthy people and a happy planet. And a big win for equality. We finally started paying care and support workers a living wage. We increased housing and income support so that everyone had a roof over their head, food on the table, and time to spend with their loved ones. Our financial stress reduced and our mental health improved. So fewer people were swept into the justice system. And yes, we transformed the justice system too. We shifted our focus away from punishment and towards prevention, restoration, and repair. With fewer people locked away in prison, we had more resources to build our zero carbon economy. In the 2030s, when we were struck with record-breaking droughts and floods, we were so grateful to have started acting when we did. We became a society that gave everyone what they needed while caring for each other and for the planet. We were in a better position than ever to navigate new crises without leaving anyone behind. Which brings us to today. Waitangi Day 2040, the day we got the news that Aotearoa would finally be a country without prisons 200 years since the tiriti was signed. Sometimes it's hard to believe how far we've come. But then I just think about how hard we worked and how compassionate and patient we were along the way. And straight up, it's not hard to believe at all.
So that was written by collaboration Just Speak and Action Station to inspire hope. And I just wanted to end on that note because I think it does that, and I recommend seeing the whole thing. Thank you so much for being here. Ngā mihi nui, and thank you for,
Thank you so much. That was a great note to end on. It's